If there's one group you don't want to have the misfortune of crossing swords with on the field of battle in Berserk, it's the Band of the Falcon. These aren't our words, they're the thoughts of the protagonist himself, who has led the life of a mercenary ever since he was a child. Griffith's seemingly invincible mercenary band was undefeated even before Guts joined them, but with his help, they became unstoppable. The Band of the Falcon was the reason that Midland won its 100-year war with Tudor, plain and simple, and their rise to the position of White Phoenix Knights seemed to be destined, until it wasn't. In a single act of jealousy and longing, Griffith tore down the band he had built from the ground up and then sacrificed it for good measure to gain power of his own. But once Femto incarnated into the physical world, he started leading a second mercenary group called the Band of the Falcon, albeit this one was completely different from its namesake, and we're not saying this just because it had apostles in it. So what exactly is the Reborn Band of the Falcon? How did it come about? How is it different from the original Band of the Falcon? And why is it, realistically speaking, better suited to achieving Griffith's ultimate dream? We'll answer all that and more in this video. This is the Band of the Falcon Reborn Explained. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. They were united by Griffith's dream, but they had ambitions of their own. The original, undefeated Band of the Falcon. When Guts first realized that the guys who had tried to rob him of his Bazuso bounty were the fabled Band of the Falcon, he was a little shocked, because the Grim Reapers of the battlefield were all practically his age, which is to say they were a couple years away from being literal children. This makes their defense of the castle Guts slayed Bazuso in all the more impressive, because they were able to stretch out a 3-day siege to 3 months, and only gave up when the situation became entirely hopeless thanks to Guts. The Band of the Falcon had earned itself a sinister reputation by being undefeated in the field of battle, to the point even the fearless Guts put his guard all the way up when he learned their identity. Our introduction to the band happened with Guts joining Griffith after being defeated by the White Falcon, but the band itself had been operating for about half a decade by that point, give or take a couple years. The original Band of the Falcon was started by Griffith when he was still in his youth with a single goal in mind: to acquire that junk he had set his sights upon in his childhood, the dream of ruling the world. At some point, after training his body and mind to become a military commander without peer, Griffith started gathering companions to start pursuing his dream. Among his first Falcons were the former miner, Pippin, the former thief, Corcus, and the former tumbler turned mercenary, Judo, all of whom joined Griffith in the nascent stages of the Band of the Falcon. They were still recruiting people and gathering war funds when Casca joined them at the age of 12, and if we are to assume that she was around 16 during her introduction in the Golden Age, then we can say that the Band of Falcon easily had half a decade worth of battle experience under their belt before they even came across Guts. After that, their formerly disputed status as the best mercenary band in existence became peerless. As Raider Captain of the Falcons, Guts led them to many bloody victories and was often the reason that they won their battles in the first place. In the decade or so that the Band of the Falcon was active before Griffith received his peerage and became a Viscount, they'd become known and feared throughout every land in the known world. Whenever an enemy force saw the Falcon banner high in the sky, they'd either tremble or charge right into it, blinded by their arrogance. Either way, the end result would always be the same: absolute victory for the White Falcon Griffith. The White Falcon's ingenious battle strategies led them to victory from their very first battle onwards and allowed them to capture the seemingly impregnable fortress of Doldry. But once Griffith became a Viscount and started engaging in more political matters for the King of Midland, a very visible gulf appeared in the way his men perceived him and how he perceived and treated them in turn. In the final chapter of the Berserk prequel chapters, titled Golden Age Part 8, Guts asks Judo what kind of a person Griffith was, and just why did his men fight for him the way that they did. He acknowledged that the Band of the Falcon felt different to all other mercenary bands he had encountered up until that point, but he couldn't place why. Judo told him that the reason the band was where it was today, the reason why they fought the way they did, and the reason why they could all laugh, cry, and behave like normal people when off the clock was because they followed Griffith. Judo Judo told Guts that Griffith's undeniable charisma was what drew them towards him, and his boundless conviction to grab everything he reached for, and that as long as the Falcons had him in the lead, they felt like everything would be fine at the end of the day. But what he didn't know back then was that Griffith saw his troops as nothing more than tools. Immediately after Judo and Guts had this conversation, the latter was summoned by Griffith. The White Falcon suggested a morning bath to wash off the hangover, and when Guts hesitated, he engaged him in a water war. At the end, Guts asked him the same question he'd asked him before the fight that decided his fate as a Falcon. Why did Griffith let him live on their first encounter? The answer was Griffith didn't feel like losing an excellent soldier. When Casca and Guts were cornered by Adon Cobberwaltz and his Tudor forces, Griffith sent out a search party not because he cared for them, but because he saw them as important gears that kept the clock known as the Band of the Falcon ticking. When Casca recounted the story of how Griffith remembered a fallen comrade on the battlefield a few years ago, she took it to mean he actually cared about his men. If she'd paid attention to his words, she'd have known he was more concerned if the boy managed to die happy living his dream, or whether Griffith's dream ended up taking his life. When Griffith sleeps with Governor Genon and explains his reasons for it to Casca the next morning, she once again conflates his selfish motivations with genuine care for his troops. Griffith told her that he seduced Genon for the money, not because he felt guilty for the deaths of his comrades, for which he explicitly denies accountability. His primary emotional motivation for doing this was not to remain clean in the pursuit of his dream, because Griffith thought it unfair that only he went unspoilt when his men faced death or worse at his command. He has always been someone who uses cold, hard logic to justify his actions, and chalks up anything that can be perceived as heartfelt emotion to either a whim or a place of importance in his grand plans. In Chapter 12, Griffith declares that he sees his band members as nothing more than excellent troops, and that to him, a true friend is someone who is his equal. To him, someone who is equal to him is someone that pursues their dream to the fullest, even if that means fighting him to get it. By definition, the Band of the Falcon doesn't fall into this category because in Griffith's mind, they're all clinging to his dream. But the Campfire of Dreams shows us that this isn't true. After surviving the encounter that earns him the nickname of the 100-Man Slayer, Guts has a conversation with Casca, where he reveals that he does know and care for his comrades. His second-in-command, Gaston, wanted to open a tailor shop in Wyndham because the army life just wasn't for him. A man called Nicole and his raider party wanted to become a captain, leading 100 men under him, so that the next time he proposed to the girl of his dreams, she wouldn't reject him. Even Casca had a dream of becoming the sword with which Griffith claims everything he has ever yearned for. Guts calls the Band of the Falcon a campfire of dreams that surrounds the blazing inferno that is Griffith, but in Griffith's mind, he's the sole bonfire of this party, and they're all moths attracted to his light. This is why he finds it inconceivable that someone would try to leave his grasp. When Guts beats Griffith and earns his freedom, Griffith falls into despair because, number one, he can't accept Guts' departure, having made him a centerpiece of many of his actions leading up to achieving his dream, and number two, he still doesn't see Guts as a person. He sees him as an object. The Band of the Falcon, though enraptured by his charisma and ingenuity in the subject of warfare, was composed of individual people with their individual dreams. Any military order was bound to have some degree of insubordination and dissatisfaction in its ranks, and the fact that Griffith had managed to hold on to his men and keep them in line for nearly a decade wasn't normal, it was miraculous. Griffith got so used to people blindly obeying his commands and clinging to his dream that he couldn't fathom someone trying to leave him. He couldn't fathom another human being doing, well, the most human being thing there is, and that is following their own path in life. Instead of coping with the loss of Guts as any good military commander would, Griffith lost all control, endangered the near 5,000 men under his command, and ended up sacrificing all of them in exchange for power as a god hand during the eclipse. In his mind, Guts was the only person who made him forget about his dream, when in reality, Guts was the only person he ever treated like a friend. Griffith couldn't accept his own emotions regarding what had transpired that snowy morning of departure, or the idea that anyone would act independent of his will. He wanted his soldiers to be entirely subservient to his dream, and that couldn't be achieved as long as all his soldiers had dreams of their own. Griffith sacrificing his band during the eclipse does signify that he cared for them, because the prerequisite for a sacrifice is that it has to somehow define the humanity of the person marked for ascendance. But we can just as easily argue that his attachment to them only extended up to their roles in helping him achieve his goal. This is why when Griffith gets the Ubik Consciousness Reaffirmation PPT, he reaffirms himself as a martyr to the god named Dream first and foremost. So when his blood is frozen and his flesh given over to the idea of evil evil in exchange for absolute power as a god hand, Griffith finally gets the tools he needs to create his perfect army. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what the Reborn Band of the Falcon is. The crystallization of Griffith's dream and the fist with which he breaks the world. What is the Reborn Band of the Falcon, and what is its purpose? When Griffith transforms into Femto, he instantly gains a natural degree of authority over every apostle in existence. It was explained in the Black Swordsman arc that though the apostles were created thanks to the God Hand, and ultimately served the God Hand's goals with their own actions, they weren't necessarily deemed as being important by those ethereal beings. In fact, the God Hand viewed the apostles as inconsequential servants, and claimed that losing more servants was not a matter of relevance to them. Everything leading up to and during the eclipse has suggested a natural hierarchy exists within demonkind, with the God Hand sitting firmly atop, and this is confirmed at the moment of Femto's birth. Every apostle that was trying to ravage Casca and savage Guts to death stopped dead in their tracks and bowed their heads in reverence to the fifth blessed demon king. Femto could command apostles with a mere gesture of his hand, and whenever apostles came closer to the God Hand, they were possessed by a fervent instinct of subservience, which Emperor Ganishka describes as being maddening. Ganishka is a special case, however, because he was an apostle who resisted the God Hand's influence and actually tried to oppose them instead of serving their interests. He's quite like Guts in that regard. Most other apostles simply submit to their natural masters, and as such, this sensation is perceived by them as a euphoric moment of bliss. Being servants to the will of the God Hand is the natural nature of an apostle, so when Femto incarnates into the physical world, they flock to his flame like so many moths gathering to a solitary light. If that description sounds familiar to you, then that's because this is exactly how we described his original band members, moths clinging to his dream of conquest. But now, he'd use that idea of a dream and of moths and flames to carve for himself an indestructible army that represented his ideal for a fighting force. In Revelations 1 through 3, the God Hand sets up the basis for Femto's incarnation into the physical world by plunging it into plague and debauchery and sending the dream of the prophetic Falcon of Light to all of those who prayed for salvation. The last person to receive this dream on page was Zod, who was convinced to join Griffith by a show of strength. The God Hand member used his ethereal body to cut off one of the Immortal One's horns, thus proving that he was indeed the strongest one that Zod had been looking for, and then proceeded to use his help to assemble what was the army of his dreams. When Griffith attacked the city of Shet, which was being besieged by Kushan invaders, he only had Nosferatu Zod by his side, and no symbols to herald his return. By the time they were done, the Falcon of Light was surrounded by dozens of kneeling apostles and Midlanders, all awed by his return as the prophesied savior of the world. Griffith did not name his new party the Band of the Falcon. That would be the Midlander refugees he saved and took with him, according to his new medium Sonia. The Reborn bit was attached to it by the Berserk community at large to distinguish both bands from one another. Still, it does make perfect sense to call it Reborn, because this new Band of the Falcon was nothing like the old one. The original Band of the Falcon was made up of individuals who had strong convictions of their own, and would follow any leader who proved themselves worthy of their swords. People often forget this, but the final leader of the Band of the Falcon wasn't actually Griffith, it was Casca. She was the one who kept them all together and alive for a year whilst being on the run from 70% of Midland's entire army. When the eclipse occurred, Judo and Pippin, the only two guys who managed to hold out against the apostles for more than a moment, jointly stated that Casca was their leader now that they'd seen Griffith's true face. And later, after being rescued by Skull Knight, Guts told Rickard that they and Casca were the last three remaining members of the Band of the Falcon. Guts was going to raid the enemy camp as he was the raider captain, and he went on a 2-year raid killing numerous apostles as a result. The point is, the original Band of the Falcon wasn't just Griffith's. Those people would willingly follow any leader who proved themselves worthy of their trust. Many of Guts' raider unit were ready to leave with him once they'd rescued Griffith from the Tower of Rebirth, because as humans, it was in their nature to do what they thought was best for them. Now that Griffith was a literal divine entity, all of that no longer applied, as his very aura made both humans and apostles feel overwhelmed with a sense of worship directed towards him. It makes complete sense for apostles to feel this way given the hierarchical relationship they share with the God Hand, but for humans, what makes them subservient to Griffith is his magnetic ode. It is stated multiple times by those who meet Griffith following his incarnation at St. Albion that his beauty now seems otherworldly. He'd always been a handsome man, but somehow, now he seemed too beautiful to be true. This appearance is what initially attracted attracts people to him. Then one thing leads to the other, and before they know it, they're on their knees pledging their undying fealty to him, despite the fact that he's a total stranger to them. This is usually how people feel in Griffith's presence following his rebirth as the Falcon of Light, but this is not what happens to Shirke or Farnese at Elfhelm. When our favorite Mistress Mage duo is faced by the Falcon of Light at Skellig Island, they're able to resist his charm and actually move according to their own wills, because as mages, they know how to shield their minds from malicious oaths. And Shirke describes Griffith's ode as being akin to a maelstrom that drowns everything around him within it. Ode is the concept of life force in Berserk, and if Griffith's life force is so strong that it gives two of its strongest mages such a tough time, then it also makes sense that any regular human would just end up becoming a mindless yes-man in his presence. With his power as a god hand, Griffith has finally assembled an army that does exactly what he wants, when he wants it, and how he wants it done, with no one questioning his absolute authority over him, or even daring to try, because they literally cannot do that anymore. Apostles can try to resist his natural influence over them, but they'll end up like Ganishka at best, or Slugcount at worst. And besides, most of them don't want to. Every high-ranking war demon in Griffith's army wants to willingly serve under him. Locus wants to finally work for a man worthy of his dedication. Grunbeld wants to finally work under a man who can truly create a just world. Zod was decisively defeated by Griffith in battle, so he now serves as his personal mount and unit commander of the most vicious war demons in Griffith's band. And Irvine is a silent guy, but we're pretty sure the same sense of devotion applies to him as well, only with an appropriate hunting analogy attached to it. All the human members of the band, Mule, Owen, Laban, and Sonia, are already captivated by his beauty and his magnetic life force, so even though they have a choice to defy him, they often forget that it exists. Laban has shown signs of realizing the truth behind Griffith's ascendance, but every time he shows one sign of realization, he shows 5 others doubling down on his fascination with humanity's savior. With every person now in the palm of his hands, Griffith finally has the army of his dream that works with the sole objective of acquiring his dream, whether they know it or not. Griffith has dressed up the current Falconian campaign to eradicate the giants as a mission to reclaim living space for all of humanity. But in truth, we know that this is just him finally picking up the pieces of that junk he set his eyes on all those years ago. The Reborn Band of the Falcon is, just like Femto, a crystallization of Griffith's idea of the perfect army, and so far, it has done everything he wanted it to, as that is the point of its existence. The Reborn Band of the Falcon almost single-handedly liberated all of Midland from invading Kushan forces, fought Ganishka's main battle line of 200,000 troops to a stalemate, and then decimated his pseudo-Shiva spawns in the final battle before the advent of Fantasia. Ever since its creation, they have become the primary peacekeepers in Griffith's ideal capital city, an expeditionary force that guides humans safely to it, and its only standing military body. All lies within the palm of the Falcon of Light, and that is why we keep repeating that word, ideal. Griffith never wanted comrades when he made the original Band of the Falcon. He wanted tools that would help him acquire his dream. He became frustrated with Guts because he didn't realize he'd started treating Guts like a comrade, and so when he lost the man, he spiraled so hard he triggered one of the worst magical rituals ever depicted in seinen manga history. Now, reborn with divine energy flowing through his ice-cold veins, he finally has the power to make the army that he needed to realize his dream, and that's exactly what he's done with the Reborn Band of the Falcon. The Holy See's revelations state that when the sun dies 5 times, a red lake will appear west of a city with a name both old and new. It is the sign that the 5th angel will alight. He is the Falcon of Darkness, the master of the sinful black sheep, and the king of the blind white sheep. He will usher in an age of darkness. This prophetic verse about Griffith's rebirth is also a perfect description of his reborn Band of the Falcon, because they really are nothing but sheep being guided to what feels like their inevitable dooms by a raven-winged shepherd. We say this because the apostles are already destined for hell. That's part of the agreement when you become an apostle in the first place. But the humans in Griffith's new capital might also be headed for that same destination, as Griffith seems to be sending their souls not to heaven after battle, but the abyss instead. But that's a topic for another video. But we wanted to bring up this prophecy because the reborn Band of the Falcon's existence was written down in scripture. If you weren't convinced that it only exists as an extension of Berserk's worst character's idolized version of an army, then there should be no doubt about it now, as that prophecy is very clearly about Griffith and no one else. In fact, the only one in the entire city of Falconia who seems even slightly interested in going against Griffith is the Apostle Rakshas, but we don't know why he wants to kill Griffith and take his face beyond the suggestion that Rakshas gets off on that kind of thing. So really, the Reborn Band of the Falcon is the same thing as Griffith after he committed himself to a demonic reincarnation. He descended into the abyss with his body of flesh, had his heart frozen, and was granted raven black wings with which to soar upon the world. With those wings, he had now gathered a herd of black and white sheep who obey his every command without question, just how he always wanted it to be. Marvelous verdict. And that's it for this video. It's amazing how Miura-sensei managed to use the entire Band of the Falcon as a symbolic motif for Griffith's fall from grace, and continued with it once he returned firm in his conviction and evil in his motivations. The Reborn Band of the Falcon is basically Femto, but an army, because it conveys those same ideas of crystallizing a man's conviction, no matter how horrifying that conviction might turn out to be. It is the perfect army that a commander could ask for, and we don't know if that's a good thing, because usually the better an army is at waging war, the more war it wages, and more warfare is the last thing a dying world like Berserk's needs at this moment. If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, be safe out there, and have a marvelous day.